Hello, everybody. Here recently, I've actually been learning how a lot of my software synthesizers and a lot of my gear in general works, not just synthesizers, but a lot of the Native Instruments bundle. Like, I know a lot of us have the Native Instruments Complete and Complete Ultimate bundles. And for the longest time, I didn't really know how all of the knobs worked on it. But here recently, I've been just reading through the manuals and watching some videos and actually figuring out how these things work. And there's, hold on just a second. I think that I am actually going to put this somewhere where I can actually see what I'm showing everybody. It's good to be able to see what I'm showing everybody so that I don't make the mistake that I've done in a few of my videos of blocking the thing I'm trying to show you with my face camera. But anyway, I think a lot of you that have the Native Instruments bundle, like, I never hear that many people talk about Absynth. And I think Absynth is awesome. Now, it's hard to work. It is a very hard synthesizer to learn how to program. Like, I might be wrong on this. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But I kind of feel like the people that originally made Absynth may have not actually been musicians. They may have just been, like, really good programmers. And a lot of the reason why I think that is because, like, a lot of the knobs and a lot of the controls are, like, called the wrong thing in here, or they work a little strangely. They don't work like they normally work. But regardless of that, Absynth is hard to learn how to program, but you can make some really, really cool sounds with it, especially like ambient sounds, and especially very kind of unusual, dark, sort of dissonant, weird ambient sounds. So, I was doodling around with Absynth earlier, and that makes me glad that I have my face up there where I can see my screen so that I didn't block the controls. So I was doodling around with Absynth earlier, and I came up with this patch. So this is obviously one of those, like, horror movie, dark, suspenseful drone kind of sounds that you hear everywhere, and to be honest, they're probably a little overused everywhere. It's like I hear them all the time in shows and movies and video games. Things that come to mind are The Walking Dead. You hear these things all the time, and the Batman Arkham games, you hear these a lot. And I think even maybe like BioShock and Fallout, stuff like that. You'll hear these things all the time, but at their core, they're just kind of any long sound running through a bunch of kind of ambient effects and whatnot. Usually a lot of, like, reverb and a lot of stuff like that. But one of the coolest ways to get these sounds is to use a thing called granular synthesis. And I know that probably a lot of you just said granular what? But granular synthesis is actually a lot more simple than a lot of people make it sound like it is, or that it sounds like it is. Granular synthesis at its core is just time stretching. It's just taking an audio file and making it longer. It's just kind of stretching it out. And it's called granular synthesis because it does that in a way of it splits the audio sample into a bunch of little pieces called grains, and that way you can manipulate it. You can speed stuff up, you can slow stuff down, you can take away grains to make it kind of thinner and grainier sounding. You can adjust a few parameters. I don't know what every parameter does necessarily, but there are a few. So this patch that I made, I'm going to turn a lot of this stuff off and just break it down to what I did step by step. So the first thing I did, I set this first oscillator to granular mode. This menu up here in Absynth, it doesn't tell you what it is. Like, that's another big thing with Absynth that makes it hard to use. It doesn't actually tell you what everything is, but I promise you should learn how to use it, because you can make really cool sounds. You switch it to granular mode up here, and then this right here, it also doesn't really tell you what it is, but this is your sample. So you click on this. How did I get into my own samples? I actually thought about, I almost made a drone in here out of like a cluster that I made with guitars at one time. I might do that eventually. And we've made drones before. I mean, you can make drones in your recording software and just play them back in a sampler if you want to. Like, you can just drop them into Contact. I have a video that, if you haven't watched it, go watch it too, of making guitar drones. They're not quite as like dark and dissonant and scary as this drone is, but let's see here. Where are my Absynth samples? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, I kind of save my Absynth samples to this side just so that I can find them. I have the same thing with Form. I've only used Form just a little bit. I probably need to go back and learn Form. But I haven't messed with it in a while. So I was like in Real Effects over here, and I was just kind of listening through some of these today. I picked this atonal piano sample, and that sounds like this. So I'd say after you pick that, you're well on your way to making a horror movie sound. That that's basically already one. But we're not just playing that straight. We're actually going to mess with it. Now, actually, on this main page, I actually thought that it started a little slowly. So I moved the sample start time. This start parameter is sample start time. It's when the actual audio file starts playing after you hit the key. And when I first opened this up, like, there was like a little second delay in it that kind of annoyed me. So I actually boosted that sample start time up just a little bit. So all of the granular settings are actually in the mod tab here. It's another thing, like, if you're gonna learn how to use Absynth, I highly recommend just like reading the manual and just camping out in the manual for maybe a week or two to just sit and really learn what all these knobs do, because they're named really strangely, and a lot of them don't have names, and it's a tricky synth to work, but I think it's worth it. I think it's a rewarding synth that's really cool. And I have some of the newer ones. Like, I'm not sitting here like as some guy that's like trying to make Absynth into Omnisphere or Zebra, because I have Omnisphere and Zebra, but I don't know, I still think even if you have Omnisphere and Zebra and some of the newer stuff, or some of the stuff I don't even have, like I know like Serum is one that a lot of people use. My phone's ringing, but I think it's a telemarketer, so I'm not going to answer it. I don't know of any calls I would be getting from California right now. But even if you have Omnisphere and Zebra, and you've bought the Native Instruments complete bundle to get like Contact and maybe Massive and the stuff that a lot of people buy Contact for, but like you keep scrolling past Absynth and not opening it, I very much recommend learning Absynth, because Absynth is capable of some really, really cool sounds, and these like drone sounds are something it's really good at. But anyway, the granular settings, the time stretching settings for the audio are actually in this mod tab. So this time percentage is actually how fast or slow the sample plays back. Think of this as sample playback time. If you want the sample to play faster, you move it to numbers above 100. If you want it to play slower, you move it to numbers less than 100. And if you move it all the way to 0, then you freeze the sample in place. And then you can use the sample start time to just pick like a area of it that you want. It's kind of like how the granular mode in Omnisphere if you've messed with it. It's kind of like the position control if you freeze it, but it's like the normal granular mode. I forget what it's called if you don't freeze it. So I slowed this down from, and it's in percentages, so 100% just plays back the sample straight the way that you have it. But if you slow it down to 10%, you get a longer, more dronier sound. So I did that, and I doodled with this density control. The density control is kind of the amount of grains. It's basically on low numbers, it's more grainy and synthetic sounding. That's kind of a cool sound too. And on higher numbers, it's like kind of a perfect recreation of all of the sound. It uses the most amount of grains to get as close to the original sound as possible, even though we're time stretched down right now and it's a lot slower. It's still playing back. But I set it around 6, and this is kind of hard on your CPU. If you set the setting too high, it kind of makes the patch really hard on your computer and really kind of, I don't know, it hits your computer harder. Sorry, I'm not the best public speaker in the world. And the size parameter, I'm not entirely sure what it's doing, but it's grain size maybe. But just doodle with this control until it sounds right. That's what I did. I just kind of like held the key and turned it back and forth until it sounded right. So that's it for the granular. Oh, well, one more thing. So I actually went to the envelope section, and the envelopes in Absynth, they're a little complicated, but they're really cool. They're really useful. They're really versatile. The way that I recommend using these envelopes in Absynth is actually click the point you want to edit, like this one that has the A by it's the attack, and you adjust the time in this BP sec menu. I know it's like the stuff's named the wrong thing. Like if it was called time, then it would be a lot easier. But once you get your head around it and you've kind of read the manual and you've kind of, or you've watched either my video or one of the videos from the people that are even better than me at working this thing, like if you want to check out some YouTube people that are really good at programming this thing, there's not that many, because Absynth is not all that popular, I think just because it's complicated. But on the ADSR YouTube channel, there is a sound designer named Jorgalad that is excellent at programming this thing. Like, he has a video where he turns a kick drum into a dubstep bass. He has a video where he does a similar kind of like drone effect to this with the the glass broke sample. And using granular synthesis and stuff. And he even has a series where he makes a whole song in Absynth, and it's really cool. And also another channel I recommend for any of the Native Instruments stuff is Dubspot. Evan Sutton has a couple of videos on Absynth that's kind of more sort of EDM-ish electronic music uses for Absynth. But it's still really cool, and there's another guy on that channel that walks through the etherizer effect, which we're going to talk about in this video, because it is, sorry about that reminder of one of my guitar students coming a couple of days early. A lot of my students wanted to take off for Halloween, and they decided to reschedule one of them scheduled for today. But any old way, the Dubspot channel is good for learning this stuff, and we're going to talk about the etherizer, because the etherizer is the coolest thing about Absynth. It's the single most awesome thing it does. In fact, and in my Guitar Drones video, I actually used Absynth effects. I pulled up Absynth as an effects plugin just to use the Etherizer on my Guitar Drones. But anyway, to the envelope, I just kind of gave it a typical pad shape with a slow attack so that it swells in, and a long release. And the way that I recommend using these, like, there's the time and there's the slope. You can actually adjust the slope, like the curve of the lines. I didn't mess with that too much in this, but if I was doing a more precision kind of envelope, I would. And I just like it. I extended the release out. The release is when you let off the key, like how long it takes it to fade out. For pads and drones and long ambient things, I usually like to have a long release so that it doesn't just cut off when I let my finger up off the key. But that's enough of that one oscillator. So what did I do with this oscillator? I ran it through a little bit of a low-pass filter in order to just cut off some excess high-end. This Hertz setting right there, that's filter cutoff. Yet again, it's named a confusing thing. It's called Hertz, and you're like, what is that? But it's filter cutoff. And this feedback control, this is another confusing thing. That's resonance. If you want to mess with the resonance, sometimes resonance is called feedback in this synth. So do I have anything in mod? Freak shift. I tend to not use frequency shifter all that much because it's kind of hard to understand. But it's cool. I mean, I think it's kind of doing like an FM sort of thing, but I haven't got that far. I did read about it in the manual, and I see people like Jorgalad and the like use it, but I don't really know what it does yet. So yeah, we have this sound that we just kind of rolled off a little high end with a filter, and it's that granular piano sound. But the coolest part of this effect, and it's my favorite thing in this whole synthesizer, is the Etherizer effect. The Etherizer, it's a grain delay. You can think of it, it's kind of like a reverb and kind of like a delay in the way that it works. It has feedback you can turn up, and it gives you a long... Technically, it's a granular delay, which is very similar. Like, it reminds me of, I used to have a guitar pedal called a Line 6 M9, and it had a reverb on it called the particle verb. The Etherizer effect is particle verb, basically. It's basically a reverb made out of the sound itself. It splits the sound into grains like the granular synthesis, and it makes a reverb out of it. So, I mean, just think of it as kind of like a cross between a reverb and a delay. And I'm gonna show you just the simple way to mess with this. So, I turn that on. Without it, it sounds like this. But with it, it sounds like this. If I turn it off again. If I turn it back on. So yeah, it's basically like it's a reverb made out of the sound itself, which is cool. So what I did with this, I pulled it up, I turned the feedback up. It kind of works like a delay pedal's feedback. It's like you get more echoes as you turn it up, and this can actually get pretty wild. This is the single most important control on Absynth or on the Etherizer, is this feedback. Like if you turn it down, you don't get much of anything, but if you turn it up, my phone is going off again. I'm going to have to pause the video for a second. Sorry about that. That actually was an important call I had to take. But we're back at this sound in Absynth. And I'm using the Etherizer effect. I turn the feedback up. That's always the first control to grab in the Etherizer. because it determines basically how much etherizer you get. I also can turn this neat feature on the surround section. It pans all of the effects in a circle. So it's kind of like the binaural panner in Logic. But like all of these dots on here are actually different signals from one of these effects. Whichever effect you have up, like, and certain ones have less signals, like the pipe effect only has like 2 signals or something. And then multi-tap has 3 because it's 3 delays. But the etherizer has 6. And if you want to spread them out, you turn this spread knob up. I did just a little bit. And if you click this rotate button, they start spinning around in the stereo field. And to adjust how fast they move, you use this seconds menu. And it almost works backwards, like lower values give you faster rotations. Higher values give you slower rotations. But you just kind of turn this on, you hit rotate, you adjust this seconds control up and down until it's the speed you want, and then you can mess with the spread control. The position will shift it left to right. And like without it. With it. Just gives it a touch more movement. It's a cool effect. It works well with the etherizer. So let's go back to the patch setting. I also had a few other things. I wanted like a high-end kind of scratchy sort of sound that kind of came in and out. So I turned on another oscillator, put it in granular mode, and I grabbed another sample. I grabbed this cellulose sample that sounds kind of like this. Just scratchy, kind of sounds like opening a candy wrapper or doodling with some kind of little hand percussion instrument. So I grabbed this cellulose thing, I transposed it down an octave. This transposed thing is the pitch, like the coarse tuning. I transposed it down an octave. In the mod section, I slowed it down to 10% of its original speed. I set the density around 5. I may have messed with the size, but like I said with the size, you just kind of turn it back and forth until it sounds right. I'm not entirely sure what it does. Let's just listen to this sound by itself. So it's going through the etherizer effect too, if I turn that off. Actually, too, I'm going to turn my reverb off over here. Sorry for that reverb being on the whole time. Okay, so that's that sound. It's not very exciting right now. I put a filter on it, but I don't think I did anything with the filter. I think it's all the way up. Yeah, it's all the way up. It's not really doing anything. And it's through the etherizer effect. A thing that I did do on it, I went to the LFO screen, which is a screen I don't see people going to all that often when messing with Absynth, but I wanted an LFO. So I set up an LFO, and if you know synthesis, you know what an LFO does, but if you don't know synthesis, it is a thing where you can set it to periodically turn a knob backwards and forwards by your distinct settings on how it does that. So I went to this menu. This menu right here is where you determine what is affected by it. Actually, I think by default this is channel volume. so I just kind of used it. I turned it off for A because I don't want the channel volume to be modulated with an LFO on channel A. And by channel A, this is channel A, this is channel B, this is channel C. They're actually labeled in there. So I have it on for B and C. We'll talk about C in a minute. And this number, this unnamed number menu down here, this unnamed number control down here is actually the LFO depth, like how much the LFO, how far the LFO turns the knob backwards and forwards. So I set it to 100% just to make it go in and out. So that's our important scratchy sound. Combine that with the first sound. And we're well on our way to making a creepy horror movie drone. If you just wanted to hear the first sound without reverb, since I just realized that I needed to turn it off. Without the etherizer effect. So it's kind of cool when you're doing sort of elaborate ambient sounds to have different layers of sound, have a mid-range sound and a high sound and a low sound. Just kind of a little tip for these drones too, playing around octave 2 actually works really well, just kind of like C2, D2-ish area. Alright, and in this last side, I just have a sine wave transposed down 24, transposed down 2 octaves, 24 semitones. And to hear that by itself, it is just... It's a sub bass, and I also have the LFO controlling the volume on it, turning it up and down, because for drones, I like to put a sub bass in there, but sometimes I do it on a separate track when I'm doing ambient stuff. But I like to have a low sine wave sub bass in there, but I like it to be like modulated in volume up and down. Like sometimes I just use the tremolo effect in Logic and just set it to like come in and out, fade in and out every like half note or something. Oh, and the LFO rate, like how fast it turns knobs backwards and forwards, is actually this number menu up here next to seconds. You can change this to beats too, and it's like, but it's not like beats like typically, like you don't get like quarter note, eighth note, 16th note. It's like a setting in beats mode of 1 is a quarter note. To get an eighth note, you have to make it 0.5. I'm saying, I don't know, but I think the people that designed Absynth weren't, like, they weren't musicians and didn't know much about music, but knew a lot about programming. Because there's a bunch of unusual, interesting stuff in there, and that's partially what makes it so cool. But, like, a lot of the stuff's named really weird, and it works really weird. And it's like, the only way you'd know is, like, either if somebody told you or if you read the manual to find out how this stuff works. It's tricky, but I promise it's a cool synth. It's really cool. So I turned that to 2 seconds because I kind of wanted it to, not necessarily to follow a beat. It's just kind of like random. The two random things are... Those two fade in and out, and this one's solid channel A. All of that ran through the etherizer effect. also ran this through a wave shaper. I think I did. Actually, let me reload the patch. I may have not ran it through a wave shaper. Let me see here. Sounds. Correction, I did not run this through a wave shaper, but the wave shaper's cool. You should use this like a distortion. That's for a different sound. I actually messed with a lot of sounds in Absynth today. Namely, I was remaking some sounds off YouTube to learn about it. But this sound I made of my own, I actually didn't use that effect. So that's the entirety of the sound inside of Absynth. But I also came in here in Logic, and I actually just pulled up my favorite reverb, Valhalla Room. This is not in the complete bundle, and I know that I'm saying all the time to use the stuff in your complete bundle because you don't need to, and use the stuff in your recording software because it's really good, and you don't have to just buy a ton of extra stuff. But if there was a thing, Valhalla, there are a couple of things that I would recommend buying separately, and Valhalla Room, I think, is one of those things. And thankfully, it's fairly inexpensive for this industry. It's about $40, but it's a really good reverb. It's a really, really good reverb. Like, I wouldn't spend a ton of money on an extra reverb. Like, I know that they're the convolution reverb Altiverb that a lot of people use for their orchestral stuff and whatnot. Seems like it's like $700 or something. I wouldn't spend that much on a reverb, but this reverb I think is totally worth $40 because it sounds really, really good and it has some good presets built into it. I actually learned about I've used this in most of my other videos too. But I actually didn't know how to use a lot of the stuff in the other videos, but I actually learned what a lot of the knobs do in here. Now, that's not to say that I tweak all the knobs for every setting, and that's not to say that I don't pull up a preset for a starting point. I still think the best way to use this is to pull up a preset for a starting point, because a lot of these knobs in here, like these different knobs shape the size and dimensions of the virtual room. Like, it's like one of these will be like if the room has sharp corners, and one of these will be like if the room has round corners, and how long the room is, and how tall the room is, and stuff like that, which is great if you want to learn how to use all of that stuff and to design your own virtual digital rooms. Be my guest. I don't tend to do the designing the room controls so much, but what I do, I tend to grab a preset. I like this Release the Kraken preset for anything that is long and washy and an effect. Basically, if it's an effect, if I'm making a pad or a drone or some kind of ambient sound, and it's like an effect sort of sound, I will grab this Release the Kraken, or I will grab... On drum sounds, I prefer Mount Doom, because Mount Doom, it's a little less high-end, and high-end gets kind of splashy on drums a lot of times, so Mount Doom works a little bit better on drum sounds, but Release the Kraken works really well on a lot of sounds. So I pulled up, I'll let you hear it with this reverb. So without the reverb, with the reverb, so I just pulled up this Release the Kraken preset, and I turned the mix down from 100 to about 40%. If you're using this as a send effect, you want it on 100. But if you're using it on the channel, you want to turn that mix down a little bit, or you won't hear any of your original sound. I turned the decay down a bit to about 10 milliseconds. Or, no, not 10 milliseconds, 10 whole seconds. This is a long reverb. I pulled the decay, which is the reverb length, basically down to about 10 seconds to get a somewhat manageable, still long and super washy reverb, but somewhat manageable. Because I didn't actually want this thing to ring out for like a whole month. But I wanted it to ring out quite a while. So I turned it down from, I think, like 15 to 10 seconds. And I think I took the high cut down just a touch. I think it's at 8,000 hertz when you open this preset. But I turned it down to 6,900 hertz. So yeah, there are a ton of presets for these things out there, and I've used a ton of presets, and I will continue to use a ton of presets for these things, because the ones that are in Absynth and Omnisphere and Contact and wherever, various libraries, the Spitfire, Steam Band stuff, there are a ton of these out there. All the ones that are in that, there are a couple of these kinds of sounds in what's it called, Alchemy in Logic, that used to be Camel Audio Alchemy. But learning how to make these yourself is actually really cool. It's not, I don't know that I would necessarily, while working on a song, if I would like make my own drone like this, but to have one made up already is really cool. It's really useful. And yeah, things to do is definitely open up Absynth, because it's a great synth, even though it's complicated to work, and even though a lot of people seem to ignore it. Open it up, check it out, learn what the knobs do, because you can get some really cool sounds out of it, and also try making your own drones. I know we all use presets, but try making one yourself. Alright, thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you liked it.